so for today, the topic we'll be talking about specifically is computational essays. This is a fairly new topic, and it's sort of built off at least the term. Actually, what I should probably do first is do a little introduction. So the computational idea, I'll get there in a second, but for the most part, it's a fairly new topic. I'll be presenting this information as always with these workshops. My name is Patrick Dudas. I have some thank yous to the Institute for CyberSciences for helping me with advertising, even though it was a little later than usual. Again, that was on my end, my fault on that end. And then teaching, learning, and technology. Typically, when we do the live version, they have the all-house lab I usually utilize, and that's through that particular group. I'm actually a PhD through the University of Pittsburgh, where I spent most of the time looking at data visualizations. And now I support here at Penn State, the Huck Institute for Life Sciences, the Institute for Cybersciences, and Everly College of Sciences. Okay, so my first sort of conversation piece, and if you've actually attended these workshops before, you'll kind of notice one thing is the fact that there's not as many slides as usual. So I'm trying to be kind of succinct in terms of the motivation for why I'm even having this type of conversation. And this first sort of thing is basically kind of specifying that when it comes to publications, academic publications, you'll have one of the first ones that I was able to sort of pull up was the Philosophical Transactions back in 1666. Was the first sort of publication that was kind of formalized, if you will. And if you think about it, the philosophers would come together, they would hang out with one another and sort of chit chat, and eventually one of them decided, hey, let's put this down in terms of on paper. And you can see in a typical article back then, there was a title, there was an abstract, and then there was an introduction, and then there'd be some figures as well throughout the actual paper itself. Fast forward to today, about 352 years later, and if you look at it now, we have that sort of same scenario still playing out. Academic papers are very much, people get, philosophers get together at conferences, PhDs, academics in that regard, to get together, and they put together these papers that have titles, abstracts, introductions, and figures as well. So that conversation piece has not changed over the last, like I said, 350 years. And so these computational essays sort of changed that dynamic. And so the idea of the computational essay is to be able to write formally in some way, shape, or form that has an introduction, a title, some sort of context to the conversation, and allow you to actually put in ways to see visualizations either dynamically or have algorithms that would allow an individual to change values and see how things change throughout the rest of the algorithm. So make these things a little bit more accessible. And my hope is someday a lot of this turns into that domain. So now, especially now that we have things like our iPads and iPhones and things of that tablets in that regards, perhaps this might be something coming in the near future and how we sort of approach articles or at least publications. So the idea is basically, over the last 350 some years, it's been about basically, if it ain't broke, why fix it kind of approach. But this has sort of changed dramatically over the last decade or so, where we are no longer living in this information age that we were sort of in, but we live in this sort of more big data age in that regard. So we have to sort of develop ways to take this data and create information and knowledge from it. So whereas something that was easily sort of graphed or sketched or sort of interpreted on a piece of paper might not be as applicable today because there's so much more information that's made available for projects, especially with the big data projects or data projects in general. Now, this concept, even though I'm mentioning the computational essay side of it, is relatively new. We've seen something similar to this in terms of interactive journalism for a number of years at this point in time. And actually, I have a couple examples I'd like to bring up. What I mean by this is basically going to web pages or sort of these articles that are now being developed by journalists and sort of having sort of an overarching conversation piece, but at the same time making it more interactive so the storytelling element is a lot more dynamic in that regard. So as we sort of scroll through here, we see that the actual web page changes, and we can kind of scroll through a little bit more. We can sort of see pop-up information sort of as we scroll through the landscape. And so this is just one example. Another one, I'll go through the New York Times. So the New York Times is sort of another, has been doing this for a number of years. They have a number of different types of these, either something that incorporates video or animation or graphs that sort of have this dynamic quality to them. There's a number of these sort of avenues that have already been developed. One of the ones I've recently saw, and kind of a cool website if you're interested, it's called pudding.cool. It kind of has a lot of these types of interactive journal articles, if you will. And so in this case, they have a title, some text, and in this case, they were looking at sort of gender specifically roles within different Disney movies. So how often a male would speak or a female would speak in the actual movie or production. And so as you scroll, you see the data, you see it sort of change and augment and kind of reorient itself as you're moving throughout the page itself. And so it's kind of a cool way to sort of explore the information while tailoring it specifically to a message, that being sort of the text and sort of the storyline as you progress. So this is something that's been around for a number of years, as I mentioned. So trying to develop platforms to do these conversations is sort of the next major step in this regards. Now, in terms of ways of actually going about doing this, there's actually a few different ways to actually go about this. The one I'll be talking about specifically today is something called observables, and it's that bottom link there. And as it's listed there, it says beta. It's only been around since about January, so it's still being developed. And one thing I'll make a note of is the fact that Mike Bostock, if you've ever attended one of these workshops before, I typically use something called D3. It's an open source library that allows people to create graphics and visualizations, animations, things of that nature. He developed that particular library with help with some colleagues. He then eventually went on to the New York Times to help work with those interactive journalism graphs and visualizations, so the things that you saw before. And about a year and a half ago left New York Times and started working on this observables idea. So basically it's in good hands, if you will, in terms of sort of the progression of its development. Other ways to actually go about doing this is Jupyter and Jupyter Lab. Again, if you've attended workshops before, we've typically used something called, you would download something called Anaconda, and then we would use Jupyter to do the actual programming steps of this. And those are types of computational essays. Typically with those, you'll have various cells kind of reading from top to bottom, and you put code at the top and sort of run it from top to bottom. So it kind of a trickle down effect, if you will. Google Collaborators is another sort of way of doing this, and for the most part, it actually uses Jupyter as sort of its main hub. Google Collaborators is actually kind of an interesting idea because you can save things to your Google Drive and sort of access things that way as well. So it might be something to look into if you're interested. So observables is basically a very interesting sort of approach to this, and I'll go through an example here in a couple seconds, but basically you're creating cells as you would with Jupyter in that regards, but in this case, everything is sort of connected to one another. So as code is changing at the top or at the bottom of the page, everything that's sort of connected to it is also updating as well. And I'll show an example here in a moment. It does only use things like JavaScript, but you can incorporate any kind of JavaScript libraries that are out there. And more functionality is being put into play literally on a daily basis. Kind of a funny situation happened yesterday evening where one of the questions that was asked at the live version of this conversation, if there was ways to take things from from observables and put it to like a local machine or to export it somehow. And prior to that event, the answer was no. Literally during the event yesterday around 4:30, a tweet was sent out by Mike Bostock, and they had implemented something like that as of yesterday evening. So I actually can show that here today. So there are ways to export these projects as well. So just to kind of clarify a little bit in terms of a little bit of these differences, So if you attended last time with the workshops, we talked about this idea of reader versus author driven. So when you're designing things like visualizations or graphs, you have to think about, is the reader driving sort of, is this reader driven in terms of how the actual messaging is getting to the individual, or is it more author driven? Author driven is basically a linear story that they're trying to tell. There's a specific message involved, and typically there's no interactivity in that regard. So that's kind of where that, even though there is a little bit more of that, so that'd be sort of a standard article. Something that's sort of in the middle would be like those interactive journalism articles. Reader driven is basically something that doesn't necessarily have a prescribed order or specific messaging per se, and allows somebody to freely interact. And that's sort of specific to what we're talking about today. So even though you're sort of describing a topic, it gives somebody the flexibility to change numbers, delete things, add things, all in sort of within this sort of environment, if you will. So even so, in this regard, there's no clear divide. So those interactive journalism articles are sort of author and reader driven. These observables are a little bit more in terms of the reader sort of having that free action, if you will. And I kind of, again, sort of from last time, a infographic would be a good example of an author-driven approach, where you have specifically an author with having sort of their characteristics and wanting to push a specific message. Something that's more reader-driven might be a model of some sort, because there's no, you're just modeling a system, and then the visualization kind of falls in between there. I think this is two more slides here, and then we'll kind of get into talking about specifically the code and some examples. So the basic component of this is you're going to go and sort of create these, the composition is sort of, you have some sort of ordinary text to it. So there's some context and motivation to it. There's computer input, so you give them a file or allow them to input information, and then there's a desired output. So connecting the input and the output specifically. An early example of this is actually something that happened back in 2001. Let me bring that up real quick. Close out of these as I'm going through them. Okay. So basically, what was done is it was sort of an idea that a researcher was going to take sort of the content of an actual article, an academic article, and make a couple of little interactive components to help sort of, heighten the information. And that's Brett Victors is the researcher who did this back in 2011. A little bit connected more to the interactive journalism approach, but basically taking sort of a static sort of publication and then having all those key characteristics, but instead of having just sort of static images, things like the algorithm itself was sort of in play, so we can actually have a little slider here that lets us sort of increment through the algorithm itself as like a probability increases, how things sort of augment within the network itself. So again, sort of just relaying the information within the actual document, but just it gave users sort of the ability to see what happens and sort of interact with the actual algorithms to help maybe increase sort of the learnability, if you will, of the actual algorithm itself. So it was one of the first sort of approaches in this regard. So I'd like to kind of show sort of an example of something like that. So this is actually one I recently just put together, and it's meant to be sort of a literal sort of random number sort of generator that produces some plots. So at the top here, and I'll talk sort of through this. Basically, the first thing you're going to need to sort of start these projects is to have a GitHub account, which I would recommend having anyways. It's sort of a nice place to put code that it's sort of maybe it might be something that's more open source or collaborate on projects, but it's a nice resource in that regards. But once you have a GitHub account, you can start creating these projects. What you would need to do is click on New, and it would start up your first project from there. And so from here, you'd start, typing in title, so testing, and being able to run it from there. You can publish it at that point. I wouldn't recommend it without a little bit more details here. But then you can go back if you want to. So I can go back to my notebooks. I can see my public available ones, or some of my draft versions. ones that are made public, and any ones that I've trashed as well. So you can kind of go through and sort of keep an idea of putting these projects together over time. So let me go back to my random number one. So in this case, again, what we have is cells. And so each of these cells, you will be able to add additional cells if need be. In this first case, and I'm going to talk about some of the terminology or the coding, if you will. I put that in quotes, in terms of using something called a Markdown language. Markdown basically is a way of formatting text in these documents. Even though this is actually applicable not only for observables, but it's also applicable for something like Jupyter or the Google Colabs as well. So this is sort of a standardized way of adding text to these documents. First thing I did was adding title, and from there I sort of gave it an introduction. So my random number generator is randomly generating number from 0 to 299. This line basically is the code utilized to sort of produce these random numbers. Basically, it's just, this part here is just a random number generator, and every 10 seconds, it goes through and creates a new random number. So it goes from 0 to 300 or 299. It's the variable name, so the variable name itself is called random number, and that's what's listed here on the side. One of the cool things you can do is the fact that in my text here, I can actually import that specific number. So as that number is being randomly generated, in my text here, it's actually automatically updating as well. So as you can see, it says for this random number, 260 in this case, which is the random number, we will then create an array. And for each indices in this array, so in this case, we have 121 positions in our array, we're just going to pick a random number between 0 and 19. And that's what's going on here. So the entire data set is being driven by this particular array. And again, next line there, I have a table that's just showing the first 5 indices and the value it's being represented by. And this again is being automatically generated every time this random number is chosen. So it's nothing, I don't have to dynamically, or excuse me, go back and rechange these tables. It's just after 10 seconds, that random number generator runs, and then all this information updates below. And from here, I have a number, about 3 different plots using that D3 library that I had mentioned before, and just 3 different ways to sort of visualize this randomly generated array in this regard. So nothing too special in that regard, in the sense of, it's just, as I'm creating these random bits of information, it's visualizing them and sort of updating the visualizations as that information is randomly generated. So, and what you could do is sort of copy through this and sort of have this sort of available to you. And the way you would go about doing that is, once you logged into GitHub, there would be a button here that says fork. You would click on that, and that would basically download this entire project and let you start editing at that point. So that's one way of actually sort of getting access to this particular document, if you will. Now, one thing I'll make a mention of, and again, this is sort of something that came into play literally last night, made available to us, basically the observable audience, if you will, is the fact that we can now export these projects. A question that was brought up yesterday was, once it's an observable, does it just stay there? So how would we share this information? One way you can do that is, if you can, once it's published, you can send somebody the link and they'd be able to access this. Or now, based on some of the new things that were added yesterday, we can actually export it as well. So specifically, I won't go into a lot of the terminology in this regards, but you can download this and actually put this into an actual web page. So this is a web page running locally on my machine that allows me to reproduce exactly what was in that observable document. So this would be sort of the output, if you will. Oops, I got somebody in chat. Great question. Both GitHub and observables are open source and available for free. So yes, you can access them. And observable specifically uses I believe it's the MIT licensing. So you can use it for, it's either that or comparable to it. So basically, it's available for you to use for research purposes, and for commercial purposes as well. So anything that you create there is basically yours at that point. But yes, GitHub and Observables are free platforms to utilize. One thing I'll make a note of is they are meant to be sort of an online presence. So GitHub, if you have a public account, people have access to it. So if you have sensitive information that you don't want to get out there, in terms of like an, sensitive information or maybe an academic project, maybe GitHub might not be the best source for you for that. You can purchase private sort of projects, if you will, but for the most part, people will typically just use the free public version. So, and again, that's available for free, open source, as well as Observable, which is free and open source as well. Okay. So back to the actual plot itself, and so this is basically my way of creating this. I was able to put this website together pretty straightforward. You could do this with any other projects that are available through Observables and sort of make it a web page at that point. And I can run this locally, so if I wasn't connected to the Wi-Fi or to the internet access here, I can still have access to it, or I can put it on a web server to make it accessible to other people as well. So basically, this is sort of your way of exporting and making this project available via other sources as well. And as I can do here, give me 1 second. The mobile version, basically, it also helps in terms of the mobile version as well. So this would be sort of the mobile version of this particular web page. So still, if you're running this on like an iPhone or an Android device, again, works pretty straightforward in this regard in terms of being able to see all that same information, see all the graphs sort of populate as that new random number is chosen. All right. So that is sort of a kind of a beginner sort of program, if you will, in regards to Observables. What I would recommend is to just kind of go to their website first off, just to kind of see, they have a number of introductions, visualizations, explorable maps, things like that. So a lot of projects that are just already pre-made for you. And also, for the most part, I know when I'm teaching things like D3 definitely has some nuances to it. So it's something where you have to kind of learn how to develop a D3 project. One thing I wanted to make note of is there are other sort of easier sort of languages to sort of take your data and make it available through something like Observable. Particularly something called Vega, Vega Lite or Vega, basically. I'll show that real quick. Oops, Vega Lite. Vega Lite is basically sort of a way to take data and sort of create sort of prepackaged visualizations or graphs that are interactive. So I'll just choose one here. So pretty straightforward in this regard. This is all you would need to sort of generate this particular plot. And basically it sort of reads in this case, a CSV. So it's a CSV sort of comma separated values, and then have different sort of encoding for X, Y, and then color as well. So, and this is basically, it would produce something like this on the right-hand side. So not a lot of coding involved, mostly sort of using a template to sort of create these visualizations or graphs. Another one I'll make mention of is something called Plotly. Plotly is sort of another way of sort of doing this as well, something you can do in R, as well as sort of an online version as well. So Plotly is basically, in the JavaScript library that Observables can utilize is free to utilize. So just another sort of option as well. So plotly.js. So again, sort of has these sort of generate sort of visualizations that can be generated with a few lines of code. So here might be an example where the data is coming from, the JavaScript utilized, and it actually has some interactivity to it as well. So I can sort of highlight other numbers as well. So again, this is something that you can be built directly into those observable documents. Okay. So a couple things to make note. So this is actually the main sort of workshop sort of template that I put together for something like this, for this conversation. A couple things to make note of is this actually is from a OpenViz, which was a conference that occurred virtually last week, literally last week, I should say, and was created on May 16th. So very new in terms of being made available. I added also things like a table of contents. So if there's something specific you want to kind of go back to, you'll be able to kind of click on it. So let's say when we've got editing, it'll direct you down to that editing section. So basically what this document has is sort of just the beginning structures of what you might need to consider when you're creating these documents, these observable documents. A couple things like shortcuts, like keyboard shortcuts are available here, so you can kind of have this available if you want to use things like that. But for the most part, and as you can tell, I've done some editing here. The first thing you'll notice is the fact that when we create a new cell, one of the first things that we want to do is just add some text to it. And that's what this markdown sort of comment is. So anything within this bracket here is going to be the text that shows up right above it. So if I put testing, and run this cell, this is now part of this document. And I can add different things to it or add other additional comments as well. I'm not going to go through every single sort of piece of this. This is meant to be sort of just sort of a resource that you can come back to. Maybe kind of make sure you hit some of the main characteristics. If you're interested, maybe some things that you can do with them. So inserting cells via the mouse clicks or keyboard shortcuts, merging cells, deleting cells, things like that. So for the most part, a lot of these are just basic interactions. But for the most part, if you want to access the content of the cell, you just click the drop-down box or the drop-down arrow, and then you'll see the code in there that could be altered or changed. Also, if you would like to kind of keep this on the screen, you can click on the little pin here, and then that would actually pin this open. So if you wanted people to see the code behind this particular, markdown piece of text, you can click on that, and that will actually show it there and keep it open for people. If you're not, you click it again, and it'll collapse again. As mentioned, Markdown is sort of the agreed upon standard, if you will, in terms of sort of the agreed upon standard in terms of ways that people are sort of creating text contents for these particular documents. And there's a couple different things you can do with this in terms of specific headers. So if you want something to be a little bit bolder and larger than others that you might see typically in like a Word document, this would be sort of your way of doing it. Different headers use basically the pound symbol or hashtags, if you will. One gives you header 1, 2 of them gives you header 2, and so on and so forth. So if I wanted to create one of header 2, I would go hashtag, and text. And then run that cell. And there's the text showing up as header number 2. And if you want to, by the way, I should have made mention of this, is once you go to this document, it's basically allowing you to also edit as well. So if you want to go in here, change some things up, it's not going to hurt the original document. The original document that I sent out to everybody is sort of controlled by me. So I sort of declare like the last time this was published. And so if you wanted to, you could go through and delete every one of these cells, and it would still work for everybody else because it's basically utilizing whatever the last published version is utilizing. So again, if you go to this particular web page and start going and putting some random text and whatnot and running it, it might look different on your end, but for the most part, no one else is going to specifically see those changes because it's sort of my published document. So if I refresh this, it'll look different for me because again, so I'm kind of like the main editor, if you will. It'll look different for me, but for everyone else, it should sort of, you're able to change things without having to worry about sort of losing the original message. A couple things as well. You can have bold text or italicized text as well. Again, it sort of has its own little nomenclature, if you will. But if you're interested in some of these things, what I would recommend for you is to go to I included a link for the Markdown tutorial, which lets you kind of go through some basic ideas in terms of here's how you do the italicized, and you can kind of edit text and whatnot and kind of follow through this sort of lesson plan, if you will. Back. Okay. You can do things like add a URL. So in this case, I added a URL to that particular slide of the Markdown lesson. You can add images. So this is an image we use typically for these workshops. So you can add an image. There's actually a couple different ways you can add images to a particular document. This is sort of the standardized way. But for the most part, one of the major issues with this is the fact that we can't set a particular size of the object, or excuse me, the size of the image. So there's a couple ways to work around that. The Markdown version of this is just to include something, the HTML tag for including an actual image. If you've ever looked into HTML at all, in terms of some of the HTML sort of ways of creating things like images or links, this is sort of the standardized way of doing it. You set the source, and then you can style it by saying, I want it to be 300 pixels big. Or you can do that directly through the HTML tag. Other things you can do are add things like block quotes, lists, indented lists as well, numbered lists, tables are pretty straightforward. So you would kind of copy and paste this template, and for the most part, you'll kind of see as you sort of set up the text, the table will sort of shrink or grow based on sort of the length of the word or the symbol or anything like that in this regards. If you want to include things like JavaScript directly into the block, there's ways of doing it. One of the cooler features about this is being able to embed things like LaTeX or however you would like to pronounce it. But for the most part, this is sort of the standard way. If you've ever written a publication before, in terms of academic sort of publications, if you're writing out an equation, you can actually do that as well within this document. So a couple different ways of doing it as well. So again, you can sort of embed sort of these standards, if you will, within LaTeX as well. So from here, there's a couple examples in terms of JavaScript, loading data, creating things like HTML, SVG, which is when we create things like in D3, those create things like SVG objects. So there's ways of just easily sort of embedding those into these documents. What I'd like to show actually next is basically sort of a very straight, sort of a beginner level look at sort of creating a observable document, importing data, and sort of outputting some information, and also eventually a graph as well. And so I kind of want to walk through this this particular document. And as you will notice as well, for each of these, I've pinned them open so you can see all the code that's involved with this. And again, a lot of times it's just more or less, for the most part, it's just kind of making it copying and pasting from other projects, or sort of some small changes here and there to get other projects working as well. So what I started off with was a header, so weather data in Vega Lite. Again, sort of that's a program that sort of you can embed within these observables. Couple things to make note of. When you want to reference other libraries, you would actually have to do it. I'm going to scroll to the bottom. I usually put these at the bottom just because I don't want them specifically taking up space. But specifically, if I wanted to include something like Vega Lite in terms of the actual library, which is actually built into observables, so it's actually very easy to do. All I need to do is include this line. And now if I want to reference Vega Lite, all I have to do is reference that particular variable, which it's called Vega Lite in this regards. I'm also use something called D3, again, built into observables, so very straightforward in this regard. All I have to do is say D3 require, and then the name of whatever I'm using from that D3 library. So again, two pretty straightforward lines in terms of I want the library for Vega Lite and I want the library for D3. And so when I reference them in this entire block of code, I just need to reference those particular variables. So again, the first thing we're going to do is that we want to import some data. And at this point, so if I go to this particular link, where this is being pulled from, oops. Oh, I totally forgot. I was waiting for a link to show up here, but it's actually being downloaded at the bottom here. So it's just a CSV file. So basically, if we open up in Excel, this would be the data sets. It's precipitation in Seattle based on dates, precipitation, temperature max, min, wind, and weather. So rain, snow, drizzle, things of that nature. So it's just using this data set as sort of its starting data set for the project. Let me go back into this. And so all I'm doing here is I have a variable named data, and I'm reading in using D3's sort of standardization in terms of reading in a CSV file. You can also do this for TSV, which is tab separated values, and JSON as well. So J, which is sort of the JavaScript sort of standardization. But again, sort of just you pick whatever you need in terms of the data source, if you will. So now I have a variable called data, and if I go into here and just take a look at data, it's an array of 1,400 data points that we saw before. If I wanted to look at the first one, I have a array of a date, a precipitation, max, min, wind, and weather as well. And we can kind of see the first object, if you will, the first part of the array. If I want to see another one, again, just sort of lets me sort of explore this, if you will. These next two lines of code are kind of just, or I should say next three lines are just some ways and sort of a template of sort of presenting what are the, in this case, the columns of our original CSV file. And so what we see here is, we call these keys instead of columns, if you will, so keys to each of these data points. And so I again, sort of just create a value for that and sort of output it. So now I have a row, if you will, the row, the actual, it should actually be columns in my data sets. So a column, the columns in my data set, again, data, precipitation, and so on and so forth. And again, this is just me sort of making sure that if somebody was looking at this particular observable document, they could easily tell that, you know, there are 6 columns that they'll be working with and what the names of each of those columns are. Next, again, I just sort of give an example data set. So basically, if you've ever used R, you might, you know, sort of the header of the actual data set. So I gave the first 3 rows. Again, hard-coded a lot of these sort of things, some ways to automate this, but for the most part, I just kind of wanted to just showcase how you might want to do this manually. And for the most part, this is just creating a table listing all the keys or all the columns in the data set, and an example for the first, second, and third data points within our original data set here. So basically from then, we would use Vega Lite as sort of our template to create the graph that you see here. And for the most part, all you have to sort of read into this is the values. So we read in the data. We sort of specify what type of graph we would like to have, in this case, a line graph, and what sort of dimensions are being encoded. In this case, we have temporal information, so and it's per month, so we want to sort of make that, you know, sort of known. So we want to list the months on the x-axis here, and on the y-axis, we just want to list the precipitation. If we wanted to, we could also do this and say, let's take a look at the temperature max. Precipitation, okay, for that. There we go. A little space in between causing an issue. So, hey, maybe we'd like to see also plotted on this is sort of on the y-axis. We want to change this to the temperature max in that regard. So all I needed to do was change that particular field to match our column name, or let's say winds. Again, pretty straightforward in this regards. So we can see the winds changing, and now we're creating these graphs pretty easily in that regards. For the most part, that's sort of a basic tutorial of how you might go about sort of creating your first project. So you don't have to worry too much about learning the D3 language that I've talked about before in other workshops, but using something like a Vega Lite or Plotly, again, is another way of doing this as well, but a simple library to start getting some of these projects up and running. So I just kind of wanted to sort of lay this out. So this would be sort of a template of a project you might want to utilize. And there's a number of available ones that are on the observable website as well. Okay, going back into my some other things that I've done before in terms of, let me bring up one other project. Oops. So other ways to also include some information as well. Like I said, you can also incorporate things like HTML, SVG, things of that nature. And the nice thing about this is the fact that when you start involving things like HTML, you can add some other cool functionality to some of these projects. Specifically in this example here, I was looking at sort of creating sort of a template for talking about social networks. And specifically one of the, one of the first sort of people to sort of talk about these and start putting these into play was somebody named Jacob Marino. And he started talking about something called sociograms. And sociograms are basically pictorial representations of people interacting with one another. And so in my example here, I included things like an image, but I also included a way to create a tooltip. And so what I can do now is sort of hover over the sociogram, and it actually produces one of those images, one of the first sociograms, particularly tied to Jacob Marino's original work. Other things you can sort of look at here is one of the things I wanted to create was also sort of a timeline so of when that actually occurred, and I also have some other timeline pieces as well. But one of the sort of the interesting things about this is the fact that if you kind of scroll to the bottom, we can look at a given graph, and one of the talking points specifically for this was looking at sort of degree type, so in degree, out degree in that regard. So I can actually change my drop-down box here to, let's say, in degree, and that'll actually update the graph listed above as well. So ways to sort of include things like drop-down boxes, sliders, things of that nature that you might typically see on like a typical HTML page, but now we're able to utilize them to dynamically change and sort of allow people and students or anything in that regards to see, in this case, this graph change based on some of those calculations. So again, some examples of how to go about doing this. And other examples I've seen as well, and I just kind of want to point these out just so you can kind of have a good understanding of what's available. You can actually include things like sound. I won't play the sounds in this regard just because it would be, they're sine waves, so they're kind of a high pitch frequencies and stuff like that. But here's a project that looks at sort of mapping out sine waves and sort of their correlations to sounds as well. So there's a play button here, and if you play it, you'd hear the actual frequency. We can change up the sine specifically to whatever hertz we're interested in looking at. Click the play, and it would play that sort of sound signature as well. In this case, this project, they look at different types of frequencies in that regards, but for the most part, it's a nice little tutorial of how to incorporate things like not only showing the graphical representation of this information, but embedding sound information as well. One of the other things I would sort of I also wanted to include as well, at least without this discussion, is sort of the different ways that we can sort of add additional functionality, if you will. There's a lot of, and I won't go through all these sort of the standard library here, but for the most part, you can, like we've already hit a couple of these as well, but we can do things like, add content via the Markdown language, via HTML as well, but for things like, we can also have things like drop-down boxes, inputs for range in terms of sort of allowing people to kind of scroll through various values. If you don't want to go to a particular source, you can also have people sort of download or sort of upload information to the particular observable document. There's a way to generate information. So in this case, if we wanted to generate values, there's sort of dynamic ways of doing that. This required statement basically is required. Basically, it's tied to whatever of the outside libraries you would like to use. And so that's sort of the standard way of bringing in those particular libraries. And this idea of, there are these things called promises. And promises basically are Observable's way of handling, sort of connecting all the dots in terms of the given document and sort of where data points sort of resolve with one another. So when you sort of create these, they're again sort of called promises, it sort of lets the program know that something's going to be changing in this particular part, and it's going to affect other parts of the actual given graph as well. So again, just sort of different ways to incorporate some interesting sort of HTML or JavaScript sort of libraries and projects that have already been developed. So another great resource in that regard. Okay. So for the most part, as mentioned before, the first things you're going to be starting to look at is how do I first start creating these particular documents, and for the most part, you're going to be using those markdown text and sort of ways of like lists and quotes and numbered information tables, things of that nature. That's going to be sort of the starting point to developing these particular observable documents. From there, it's basically learning a little bit of JavaScript to kind of help you in terms of getting data and sort of information that's accessible to the reader or the observer in that regard. And for the most part, some of these things are as simple as, in this case, our x variable equals 42, and allowing somebody to change that to another number and seeing what happens. This is sort of true in terms of our random number. If I come back to our random number plotter, for the most part, I have a function that's sort of randomly generating this number for us, but if I wanted to, I could set this to 123. Play, and now, as you can see, it's going to be our array is 123 in size, and for the most part, it's going to update all those graphs as well. So some of this is very simple in terms of you know, variable equals a number or something to that effect. So even at that lower level, you can start developing these observable documents. So for the most part, I've actually was able to sort of cover most of what I wanted to talk about. One of the things I just wanted to mention today was starting to get people interested in this observable idea, sort of mention ways to start creating some of these observable documents, let people also know, because of what I've learned recently was the fact that you can actually start not only publishing these and making them accessible that way, but downloading them and making them into your own personal projects as well. So that's something that actually can be done very recently as well. What I'd like to do in terms of the amount of time I have left here today, I know I'm cutting off a little bit earlier than usual, but I'd like to open this up in terms of questions. Trying to remember if there was any questions from yesterday's that I would like to bring in today, but for the most part, typically people are just, you know, sort of questions were sort of revolving around sort of that idea of being able to download and use these offline as well. So if there's any questions, I'd be happy to take any questions now via the chat. If not, we can kind of end our conversation for today, and what we'll be talking about next week, or excuse me, next month in June for the next workshop. I'd actually like to sort of showcase next month, basically from a data source to a completed animation. So I kind of want to walk through an entire project basically with the group, because that's typically what I'll get question-wise is, how do we just start to finish? How do we get a project going? This will also include things like my interactions with an actual professor or a faculty member to sort of get their design ideas together. Also, once I have an animation together, how do I record this and put this and make it available via either, you know, a visualization or via video as well. So that'll be handled next month. So I look forward to having that conversation as well. But again, I'd like to kind of stop things for today in terms of this workshop, but I'd like to make sure I open it up to questions if there are any. If not, I'm very happy sort of presenting this information today, and I'd be happy to follow up with anybody if there's follow-up questions at all. And, you know, as normal, please let me know if there's any questions after the fact, and I'd be happy to sort of address them as well. So kind of keep an eye on the chat here. Okay. Chat. And just kind of keep an eye on to see if there's any other questions. If not, again, I'd like to thank everybody for coming out today. Like I said, next time I'll be doing a much better job in terms of getting the message out a little bit earlier than I did in with this particular workshop. But for the most part, again, questions, always feel free to email me or send me messages, and I'll be happy to sort of respond that way as well. So thank you everybody for coming out today, and very much appreciate everyone participating as well. So I'll stick around on the chat here just in case there's any follow-up questions. But if not, thank you everybody for coming out today.